All right, so today we're going deep on this guy, James Opelton Bradley. And wow, you sent over some pretty intense material on this case. It's really going to stick with you.
Yeah. I think one of the most compelling things about the Bradley case is just that it isn't just like one point in time. It kind of unfolds over decades.
Right.
And it really gives you a look into, I think, patterns of behavior and the limitations of our justice system and, really just sort of the psychology of repeat offenders.
Yeah, we're talking about a man convicted of 3 murders, and his crimes span from the late 80s into the 2000s.
Right.
And he even wrote these short stories while he was in prison.
Yes.
Like really graphic stuff about women being murdered, almost like he was foreshadowing his own future.
Yeah, those stories, I think, are definitely more than just creepy. They're definitely kind of a window into his psyche. Some experts believe they could indicate what's called the McDonald triad.
Oh.
And so that's bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals in childhood, which, sometimes that's associated with later violent behavior. And while we don't have all the details of Bradley's early life, I think those stories definitely raise some serious questions about his state of mind even back then.
Yes, like his dark imagination kind of bled into reality.
Right.
So before we get into the specifics of his crimes,
Yeah.
let's just start in the basics.
Yeah.
Like, who is James Opelton Bradley?
Yeah. So he was born in North Carolina in 1962.
Okay.
And he served as an Army sergeant, which I think adds another layer of complexity to his profile.
Right.
Exposure to violence and just the structured hierarchical environment of the military. I think that could have had a really profound impact on him.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that we see a lot
Right.
with people who have those sorts of backgrounds.
Right.
You mentioned patterns of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we see that emerge in his story?
So his first known crime was in 1988, and it was the murder of his 8-year-old stepdaughter, Ivy Gibson. And, it's a horrific case, and it's made even more disturbing by his initial attempt to deceive authorities.
Oh, right. He tried to stage a kidnapping, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He claimed that she was taken from her bus stop.
Right, right.
And he fabricated this really elaborate story, even describing a struggle with like an imaginary abductor, which I think is a classic example of a narcissist trying to control the narrative, even in the face of this horrific act.
Yeah, he's trying to almost distance himself from it.
All right.
In a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he eventually confessed, right?
He did.
What was his explanation for killing her?
So he claimed that he just snapped after she woke him up.
Oh, wow.
Said that he choked her with a sock and then disposed of her body at a landfill.
Oh, my gosh.
It's a very chillingly matter-of-fact description of a truly monstrous act.
Yeah.
And I think the detail about the sock, it kind of suggests a level of premeditation that contradicts his claim of snapping.
Yeah. I mean, if you're snapping, you don't really think about what you're going to use to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It seems like he was prepared in a way.
Yeah, so he pleads guilty to first-degree murder, and he's sentenced to life in prison.
Right.
But with the possibility of parole.
Yes.
And that's where he writes those unsettling short stories.
Right.
We'll have.
Yes, he writes The Beast Within and Serial Killer.
Oh, what?
And they feature these really graphic descriptions of violence against women, often kind of imbued with sexual overtones.
Mm-hmm.
They're really disturbing, and they raise a lot of questions.
Right.
Like, was he reliving past traumas?
Oh,
was he fantasizing about future acts?
Mm.
Were they a form of psychological release or a chilling sign of things to come?
Yeah, and you said earlier that these stories might offer insights into his psychology beyond that McDonald triad.
Right.
Like, what else could they reveal?
So I think they could indicate a deep-seated resentment towards women.
Oh, yeah.
Perhaps stemming from unresolved childhood issues or negative experiences, during his military service.
Right.
It's also possible that, writing these stories was a way for him to exert a sense of power and control.
Okay.
Especially in the restrictive environment of prison.
Yeah, makes sense.
He's behind bars.
Yeah.
He's stripped of his freedom, his autonomy.
Right.
And so creating these narratives where he kind of dictates the fate of his characters could have been a way for him to reclaim some kind of semblance of control.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And that need for control, that inability to cope with feelings of powerlessness,
Right.
I think that could be a key factor in understanding his subsequent crimes.
So we've established a bit about his background and this potential pattern of violence and deception.
Right.
And now I know that he was eventually granted parole.
Yes.
And that's where things take a really dark turn.
Yes.
But I think we need to pause here for a moment and let that sink in?
Yeah, I think it's important to just acknowledge the gravity of what we're discussing here.
Yeah.
You know, a young life was lost. A family was forever shattered.
Right.
And tragically, this was just the beginning of James Opelton Bradley's reign of terror. So, Bradley, he's granted parole in 2013,
Okay.
and it's a decision that will have devastating consequences.
Right.
Less than a year later, 33-year-old Elisha Tucker disappears.
And this is just the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, looking at this timeline you sent over, another woman vanishes soon after.
Yeah, in April of 2014, Shannon Rippey Van Newkirk goes missing just a day before her birthday.
Oh, gosh.
2 women gone without a trace, and their lives just tragically intertwined with James Opelton Bradley's release.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder of that difficult balance the justice system has to strike.
Yeah.
You know, rehabilitation is so essential, but public safety has to be the priority.
Right.
What can you tell us about the investigations into these disappearances?
So initially they were treated as separate cases,
Right.
but then kind of a twist emerges.
Oh.
While searching for Van Newkirk, police find a body. And at first they believe it to be hers.
This is where it gets even more complicated, isn't it?
It does.
I mean, the misidentification must have been a huge setback for the investigators.
Absolutely. It highlights the just critical importance of forensic science,
Right.
especially in cases where you have decomposition or other factors that can make visual identification difficult.
Right.
But they are eventually able to positively identify the body as Elisha Tucker's.
So not only is Bradley now a suspect in 2 disappearances, but there's a confirmed murder.
Right.
How did authorities connect him to Elisha Tucker?
Well, the discovery of her body was really just the beginning. You know, through painstaking investigation, they uncovered this trail of evidence that pointed directly at Bradley.
Right.
Phone records placed him in the vicinity of where Tucker was last seen. Witnesses reported seeing them together in the days leading up to her disappearance.
Okay, so they had some, anecdotal evidence at least at that point.
Right.
But what about physical evidence? Was anything found that, definitively linked him to the crime?
So that's where things get a little bit interesting.
Right.
You know, remember Bradley was a former Army sergeant. Right.
So he had some knowledge of forensics and investigative techniques?
Oh, so he knew kind of what to look for.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
So it seems he took steps to cover his tracks. But he wasn't entirely successful.
Okay.
Forensic analysis actually revealed traces of Tucker's blood in his vehicle.
Oh, wow.
Despite his attempts to clean it.
So even though he was trying to be careful,
Yeah.
he left something behind.
Right, there's always something.
Yeah, it sounds like they were building a really strong case against him, even without a confession.
They were?
Did he ever admit to killing Elisha Tucker?
No. He maintained his innocence,
Really?
but the evidence was just overwhelming.
Right.
He was charged with her murder and ultimately found guilty.
But what about Shannon Van Newkirk? Her body was never found, right?
That's right.
How did they proceed with that case?
That's one of the most perplexing aspects of this whole story.
Yeah.
Despite the lack of a body, the prosecution felt they had a strong enough case to move forward. They relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. Okay.
Similar to what they used in the Tucker case.
Okay.
Witness testimony, cell phone data, placing Bradley and Van Newkirk together, and just that disturbing pattern of behavior.
That pattern being his history of violence against women and those disturbing short stories he wrote in prison.
Exactly.
Did the prosecution use those as evidence?
They did.
Wow.
They argued that those stories, while fictional, provided a glimpse into Bradley's psyche,
Right.
revealing this dangerous obsession with violence and control that really mirrored the circumstances surrounding Van Newkirk's disappearance.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a compelling argument, for sure.
Right.
But without a body, wasn't it difficult to prove that she was actually dead, let alone that Bradley was responsible?
It was a risky legal strategy.
Yeah.
But the prosecution believed that the totality of the evidence combined with Bradley's past really painted a clear picture of his guilt.
Right.
And ultimately, the jury agreed.
Wow.
He was convicted of second-degree murder in Van Newkirk's case.
Wow, so 2 convictions, 2 women dead. It's a horrifying outcome, especially for the families left to grieve without answers.
It is.
Did Bradley ever express any remorse for his actions?
Not really.
Did he ever offer any information about what happened to Shannon Van Newkirk?
That's where this case takes an even darker turn.
Okay.
Prosecutors, desperate to bring closure to Van Newkirk's family, they offered Bradley a deal. They said that they would take the death penalty off the table in exchange for information about the location of her body.
Wow. So they were willing to give him a chance at life if he just helped them find her remains.
Yeah.
Surely he must have considered that.
You would think so,
Yeah.
but shockingly, he refused.
Oh my gosh.
He chose to keep that information to himself,
Wow.
denying her loved ones the chance to properly lay her to rest.
That's just unfathomable.
It is.
What could possibly be his motivation for doing that?
Wow.
Why withhold that information knowing the pain it would cause?
It's a question that has haunted everyone involved in this case. Some speculate that it's about power, a final act of control over his victims and their families.
Right.
Others believe that he enjoys the notoriety, the idea that he holds a secret that no one else knows.
Wow.
Or maybe it's a combination of both.
It's hard to comprehend that level of cruelty.
It is.
It's like he's reveling in the suffering he's caused.
Right.
But even with his refusal, he's still facing serious consequences, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
While he avoided the death penalty in the Tucker case,
Right.
he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for both murders.
Wow.
He'll spend the rest of his days behind bars, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of his actions.
Right.
But for the families of his victims, the pain and the questions, they linger.
Yeah.
Especially for the loved ones of Shannon Van Newkirk, who still don't know where she is or what truly happened to her.
It's a heartbreaking reality.
It is.
And their search for answers may never end.
That's right.
It's a reminder that justice, even when served, can't always erase the pain or fill the void left by such senseless loss. I mean, it's hard for me to wrap my head around, the fact that he just refused to give them that information.
Yeah.
It's almost like he wanted to hold on to that last little bit of power he had left.
Yeah, it really is a level of cruelty that's difficult to grasp.
Yeah.
And it raises these complex ethical questions,
Right.
Is offering a lighter sentence in exchange for information like that, is that exploiting the system? Or is it the only way to bring closure to families who have already suffered so much?
Yeah, and I can see both sides of that argument.
Yeah.
On one hand, it feels like he's getting away with something.
Right.
But on the other hand, the families deserve answers.
Right.
They deserve to be able to lay their loved one to rest.
Exactly. It's a moral dilemma with no easy answers.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to just the broader complexities of our criminal justice system.
Yeah.
We're constantly striving for this balance between punishment and rehabilitation and the pursuit of justice for victims.
And in this case, it seems like justice remains elusive,
Yeah.
at least for Shannon Van Newkirk and her loved ones.
Right.
It's a haunting reminder that even with convictions, the story doesn't always have a neat ending.
That's true. And it really underscores the profound and lasting impact that these crimes have on the victims' families. They're left to grapple not only with the loss of their loved one, but also with the unanswered questions,
Right.
the lack of closure,
Right.
the ongoing trauma of not knowing.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've explored this really twisted path of James Opelton Bradley,
Yeah.
from his early life in military service to his horrific crimes.
Right.
And then that chilling refusal to reveal the location of Shannon Van Newkirk's remains.
It's a case that has captivated and horrified the nation.
Yeah.
And it raises so many questions
Right.
about the nature of evil, the limits of our justice system, and that just enduring search for answers in the face of unimaginable loss.
Yeah. I mean, what's the one takeaway that you hope our listener walks away with?
Well, I think it's essential to remember that while this case is extraordinary, in its brutality and complexity, it also reflects these broader societal issues.
Right.
We need to examine the factors that contribute to violence, the effectiveness of our rehabilitation programs, the support systems that are available for both victims and their families.
And, perhaps by understanding the motivations and the circumstances that lead to these horrific acts,
Right.
we can work towards preventing them in the future.
Exactly.
It's a daunting task, for sure,
It is.
but one that I think we as a society must continue to pursue.
I couldn't agree more. Awareness, education, a commitment to addressing the root causes of violence. These are all crucial steps in creating a safer world for everyone.
Well said. And to our listener, if you've been as captivated by this deep dive as I have, I really encourage you to continue exploring, these complexities of criminal psychology and the ongoing efforts to understand and prevent violence.
Yeah.
There's so many resources available out there, from books and documentaries to podcasts like ours and research articles.
Right.
But for now, we'll leave you with this thought.
Okay.
What systemic changes, if any, could be implemented to better address cases like James Opelton Bradley's? How can we improve the parole system, enhance support for victims' families,
Right.
and work towards a justice system that truly serves everyone?
Those are the questions.
These are difficult questions, no doubt.
Yes, they are.
But they're worth pondering, I think, as we strive for a society where these tragedies become less frequent and where justice prevails.